All right, so we should probably get started. We'll probably have a few more people coming in, but I want to reward you guys for actually getting up this early by starting pretty much on time. Before I do get started, there's a few things I want to just go over, but general things. First of all, the people in this section, when I go over here to do my demos, you probably won't be able to see me because they didn't design this with short people in mind. So sorry about that, but hopefully if you really need to see what I was looking like when I was doing the demos, you can catch the video later. Another thing, it is St. Patrick's Day, and most of you aren't wearing green. So if you could just refrain from pinching each other until after the talk, I'd really appreciate that as well. And then the third thing is that you might notice my voice is a little raspy. I lost my voice last week and still haven't quite found it yet. So in the middle of the talk, I might get a little choked up. I'm really passionate about these things, and so I'll just have to pause and cough for a while, and then we'll get right back to it. So I apologize in advance if I have to do that. I'll do my best not to, but I don't always get to control when the passion overtakes me. So with that, I'm going to get started. I'm going to be talking about designing an internet-facing website using SharePoint 2010. If that's not the talk you're here for, you should probably go find where you're supposed to be, because that's what I'm going to be talking about. My name is Elizabeth Olson. I work at Microsoft as a program manager on SharePoint, so a couple of these features I'm talking about are actually my features. Feel free to be as nasty as you want to be about them, but just keep in mind I am very passionate about them and I really love them. So I'm going to assume that most of you aren't very familiar with SharePoint. I'm going to kind of explain a few things that might be obvious if you've used SharePoint for a while, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. But by and large, this is going to be kind of an overview. I'm not going to design necessarily a specific website, but I'm going to show you how it could be done and give you a few examples at the end of how other people have done it. So when you think about SharePoint, you probably picture something like this. It's a normal team site. It's where work gets done. It's built around the idea of collaboration. But what really matters for us is that it's kind of boring. And I hate to say that because our UX team worked really hard on making this look as good as possible. But at the end of the day, it's gray, it's not very shiny, it's a place where work gets done, and it's not something you'd ever put up on the internet. On the other hand, when you think about an internet-facing site, you probably think about something more like this. This is pretty shiny. I think actually Ferraris are really sexy, so I really like this website in particular. But if you look at this, you would never know that this is running on SharePoint, and yet this is one of the sites we use to promote SharePoint as an internet-facing website provider, is just this idea that you can do things like this with SharePoint, and it's relatively simple to do, and there are a lot of great features around SharePoint that enable you to get a great experience around that. So SharePoint comes in many flavors. It's a whole spectrum, and this is where people get a little bit confused as to whether or not SharePoint is appropriate for an internet-facing website. A lot of people think about SharePoint just in the team site aspect, where you don't really design anything, you just kind of put it up and let people work there. There's a bunch of authors, there's no approval process. It's just basically set it up and let people get stuff done. There's a step up from that, which is kind of like a divisional portal site, where you might brand it a little bit, but really it's still about people getting work done. So you might limit the authors a little bit. You might put in an approval process, but by and large, this is still kind of a boring place to be. The corporate intranet site is a step up from that, and there you would put in more branding. You would probably put a workflow process around making sure that only the right content gets up. But this is still internal to your company, and it's still supposed to be a kind of serious place. So you may or may not actually invest very much in branding that. Now, earlier in the conference, Paul Stubbs gave a talk on Monday about designing a corporate intranet site, and that's already available online if you want to watch it if you didn't catch it on Monday. And there's a lot of overlap between designing a corporate intranet site and designing an internet site, so I would really encourage you to check that out because he covered a few things that I'm not going to cover and vice versa, so it's worth having both sets of knowledge when you start on your own project. But what I'm going to be talking about today is this concept of an internet-facing site. And this is somewhere where you need to have pixel-perfect branding. You can only have the right content up there. So you really limit who can write to your site, and you have an approval process around what actually gets published. It's a really structured idea and a really structured design. And I'm going to work you through kind of how that works in SharePoint. So to just start off, SharePoint has a few tools that you'll probably be using if you get heavily into SharePoint branding. The first one is obviously the browser. That's where a lot of the content creation and editing will come from. And that's inside of an existing site, obviously, but that's a great tool for your content creators. They can just work in the browser in an environment that they're kind of familiar with, and then it can go through the SharePoint process and get up to the site eventually. There's SharePoint Designer, which is more about designing around a site instance. So if you have an existing site, creating a specific brand around it, working with the master page, that kind of thing. And then Visual Studio is kind of like the Uber tool for SharePoint. It's really advanced. If you need to write code, you'll be using Visual Studio. Or if you need things like source control, or if you need reusable templates, those all come from Visual Studio as well. In Visual Studio 2010, we've done a lot of work to integrate that with SharePoint. So SharePoint is a top-level citizen in Visual Studio, and they've got a lot of projects that are specific to SharePoint. So I really encourage you to check that out and see what you can do with Visual Studio. It's really amazing. Some other general goodness I want to talk about. We have full cross-browser support. We have IE7 and 8 and Firefox as Tier 1 browsers, and Safari is technically a Tier 2 browser according to our documentation, but given my experience with how we've actually worked with Safari internally, I would call it more like a 1.1. So there's a couple advanced scenarios that probably won't work in Safari, but by and large, I don't think your content creators will ever hit those experiences, and your users, visitors to your website probably won't ever hit those experiences either. Now, we did cut support for IE6. This may be the only place where that's a good thing. A lot of people tend to yell at me about that, but you guys probably don't feel that strongly about IE6, which is great. We all want to get rid of that. But we are targeting the WCAG 2.0 AA standard. We've worked really hard to make that a priority this release and hit that standard. So accessibility is definitely important to us, and we know it's important to you as well. We are also using standards-based rendering, so XHTML and CSS-based rendering. Now, we haven't gotten rid of tables entirely. There are some web parts that might emit tables for layout and whatnot, but the Chrome is all div-based, and if you really want to have a fully XHTML-compliant site, it's possible for you to do that on SharePoint 2010. Now, the last thing I want to point out on this slide, I'm calling out the rich text editor, and it doesn't really look like the rest of the things on here. It's not standards-based. It's not a cross-browser thing, but really it's just the rich text editor is kind of a WYSIWYG experience for content creators within the browser. And so it gives them an experience that's very much like Word and very much like an experience they're used to when they're creating that content, and they don't have to understand HTML or CSS or anything like that to get their content up and looking the way they want it to. And then beyond that, in the rich text editor, we also have a button that they can push to make what they've created fully XHTML compliant. If you really want to push the lever over to full XHTML, you can force them to have that XHTML compliant content as well. So that's all really important, I think. So moving on, we've got this reusable control platform, and so that's things like the ribbon, the dialog framework, status bar notifications. These may or may not make sense based on what experience you're trying to build with your website. If you've got a checkout system, it might make a lot of sense to use the status bar and the notifications area to tell users what's going on with their shopping cart or whether or not they've actually paid for the order yet. But on the other hand, it might not make sense. You don't have to use these. We provide them as a control platform. I'm not going to speak about these in the rest of the talk, but if you want to learn more about how to use these and how they're built, I'll be giving a talk at the end of the month as a webcast, and I'll have a link for that at the end of the deck as well. So I'm just going to start walking through the steps you would take to build an internet-facing website. The first one being you need to turn on anonymous access. Obviously, on the internet, no one knows who you are. You're fully anonymous. You could be a dog for all anyone knows, like that New Yorker cartoon. So when you're turning on anonymous, there's two places in SharePoint where you need to flip a switch. It's both at the server level and at the site collection level. So you flip both of those switches, and everything's good to go in terms of anonymous access. One thing to keep in mind is we have this feature called the lockdown mode. And what that is for anonymous users, it makes it so that they can't view certain forms pages or layouts pages. And the reason for that is you might have a bunch of libraries or lists or data in your site that you don't want visitors to see. And say you have a list called merger. And none of the content there is available to anonymous users. But if they have the right URL, they could potentially see that you have this list called merger. And that might be information that you don't necessarily want to actually convey to people until you've announced that you're going to have a merger. So the lockdown mode will turn off the forms pages that would otherwise let people know what the lists and libraries in your site are. So that's a reason to turn it on. Publishing sites in SharePoint have the lockdown mode enabled by default. Other sites, you'll have to turn it on manually, and you can also turn it off on publishing sites if you'd rather go the other direction. It is something that you should consider carefully which way you go in terms of the information disclosure versus limiting people's access to things in SharePoint. One case where you might want to turn off the lockdown mode is if you have a public-facing blog built on SharePoint with the blog template. A lot of the pages in the blog template are actually turned off with the lockdown mode, so that's just something to keep in mind as a consideration when you're deciding which switches to pull. So master pages are a concept in SharePoint that's really straight from ASP.NET master pages. A master page basically controls the Chrome across your site. So the common UI elements, like how the title is laid out, how the nav structure is laid out, that's all controlled by the master page. And then the content pages basically fill in, I like to call them holes in the master page. The technical term for them are content placeholders. And so the content placeholders define places where the content page can add more content to the rendered page. There are a couple gotchas around using master pages in SharePoint. The first one is that we use a lot of content placeholders. We use 2 or 3 dozen placeholders. And it might seem like you don't need all of those, you don't want all of those, you don't want to use all of those, but I'm going to tell you, please use them anyway. If you don't use all the content placeholders, ASP.NET has this really nasty bug where if there's a content placeholder missing that a content page tries to fill in, then it's a really ugly error. We can't really catch it, and it's a bad user experience for everyone. So just put them on the master page. You can hide them. You can use CSS to make sure they're not visible, but they just need to be there from a technical perspective. The other thing that's a gotcha I've seen a lot of people get caught up with already in SharePoint 2010 is we're shipping this master page called minimal.master. And that sounds like a place where you'd want to start with your design, right? Minimal, that means it's minimized, there's not as much to work with. That's not actually what minimal means for us. In this version, what minimal means is a master page with minimal Chrome that's built for particular application scenarios. So it doesn't work with team sites, it doesn't work with publishing sites, and what it works with is more application scenarios like the search experience or the web versions of Word and Excel and PowerPoint all use minimal.master out of the box. So if you're building something like those, then you might use minimal.master, but if you're building a normal site, you probably want to start somewhere else. The 2 places that are probably going to be most common as a starting point is either using one of our out-of-the-box master pages and pulling things out and adding things in until you get where you want to be, or you could also start with this master page that we've released called starter.master, and that's up on Code Gallery right now. It'll eventually be rolled into the SDK. And I'll give you a link to that at the end of the deck as well. But Starter is kind of a minimized version of the master page where most of the Chrome has been removed, and you can start there with your designs. So with that, I'm going to have my first demo. And I'll switch this over. So this is an out-of-the-box publishing site. It looks exactly like it would look if you created your own publishing site in SharePoint 2010. And I just want to point out, like this area at the top, this is controlled by the master page. These are the site-wide Chrome elements that you'd be using. But there's a couple things like right here where the content page is actually filling in this home title and telling the master page what to put there. This part of the page below the yellow bar is all content, so that's filling in another content placeholder. So that's kind of how the master page is laid out in SharePoint. Now, just as an exercise to see how things can change if you change the master page, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to switch to the other out-of-the-box master page, v4.master. And this is the master page that's normally applied to team sites, but it works with publishing sites as well. And immediately you can see that this is kind of different. It's got a different area up here, but it's got the same kind of things filling in with the home here and the content below here. Now, that's kind of interesting, but it's not all that great. So what I did is I started with starter.master, and I created knitting.master. So I should probably let you know that I'm really obsessed with knitting. I do it all the time. And I'm also not a designer, so this is not going to look good. But it is going to look different, and that's the point here. So what I did is I took starter.master and I actually pulled a few more things out. Starter.master actually includes things like the ribbon and the status bar notifications area, those kind of controls. And I didn't want that. I wanted really simple, really easy, and so I pulled those out. But what I have here is there's some SharePoint goop. I have a CSS registration control that is linking in my knitting CSS to style my page the way I want it to. And the reason I used a CSS registration control instead of just linking directly is because I also wanted this to be themable, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's one of the important steps for theming. And then you can kind of see where there's different content placeholders, and there's definitely a lot of them. No one's going to lie and tell you there's only a few of them. There's a lot of content placeholders. But I've put all of them in divs that are hidden, or I put most of them in divs that are hidden so that they don't affect the rendering of my layout at all. And they're just there for technical reasons. So what's really important with my master page is this section right here. This is the thing that I created. And so like it says at the bottom, no one else should be blamed for this. This is entirely my fault. But this is really what's controlling the rendering of my pages in SharePoint. And this is the really important part of my master page. So now that I've shown you that, I'm going to go and actually use that master page. And we'll change knitting.master. And the reason we have two master page settings here is in case you want to have a different look and feel across your pages. The site master page is used by the publishing pages, so those are the things that we think you'll really expose to internet-facing users. The system master page is more for application type pages or for team site pages, so those are things that we think are more internal. You can set either of them to any master page you want. It's just you have the ability to set them independently of each other if you want to do that instead. So this is my knitting master page. It's very different from the original, but it doesn't look great. No one said it was going to look great, but it does look like it's a knitting site. And then I just wanted to do this as a way to show you that it can look very different in SharePoint just by how you change the master page. But you can still have the same content like right here, and you can still have the same things like the title coming from the content page and style them however you want. So master pages are very powerful, and that's where you're definitely going to be starting whenever you start with SharePoint customization. So moving back to the presentation, so that's master pages, and those are probably where you're going to spend the brunt of your work customizing SharePoint. We also have this concept of page layouts. So these kind of act like a pseudo-nested master page, and that's a horribly technical term, so I'm sorry for using that. But the way this works is there's the master page at the top, and there's the content page at the bottom. And in the middle, you can use a page layout that tells the content page how to lay out the content. So there's no Chrome associated with a page layout. It's much more like, I need you to have a text item here and a picture here, and I need you to have a list down here and a web part down there. So it's very much organizing how your page is laid out, and it gives you some consistency across pages so that your users know where to expect specific information and how to navigate pages within your site. You can make them as restrictive or as loose as you want. You could make a page layout be just a rich text control across the entire page and let your users decide what to put within there. Or you can make it very strict in terms of what can go where. So that's another tool you can use to organize how your site is designed. Now, there are 7 special pages in SharePoint. We don't really have a good term for referencing these, so I'm just going to list them here. But these are the pages that don't pick up the site master page. And the reason we did that is because these are really critical pages. You don't want just anyone changing them. And you have to protect them from things like JavaScript in some cases, like the login page. You don't want anyone who has JavaScript access to be able to put JavaScript on the login page that says every time someone logs in, send their data over here as well. So we protected these. But you can still completely replace them, completely brand them yourself. It's just a different mechanism to do so. So I'm just going to show you that because it's actually really fast and easy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to brand the error page rather. So first I'm going to show you what the error page looks like. And since I can't consistently reproduce an error when I want one, I'm going to navigate to the page. So this is pretty plain and boring. It says Microsoft SharePoint Foundation, which I'm sure none of you actually want to expose in your internet site. And this is just something that no one wants to see, right? So what I did is I created on the file system of the server running SharePoint. And actually, technically, I'm running SharePoint on a client OS. That's not something that we support for production, but for development and working with your customizations, you could absolutely be running SharePoint on a 64-bit client operating system like Win7, and that's what I'm doing here. So what I did was I created a folder called MIX under the layouts folder on the file system, and inside of that I created a page called error.htm. So it's not even ASP.NET, it's just really, really simple. And just to prove how simple it is, I'm going to just show you the markup for my page is pathetically small. This isn't something you'd probably put on your own error page, but this is what I'm going to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into PowerShell. And if you've never used PowerShell, this might look a little intimidating, but it's actually not that bad. And I actually only started using PowerShell about 2 weeks ago, and I can already kind of figure it out. So I'm sure you can all figure it out as well. So I'm going to just set a custom layouts page, and I want to set the error page. And the path I want it to point to when I'm done is layout/mix/error.htm. And then the web application I'm doing this on is my machine, which is Elisol Athena. I'll click OK. And then I'm just going to do a quick IIS reset. And so what that's going to do is that's going to redirect anytime someone hits an error page, it's going to redirect to my page instead. And I'm just going to do this IIS reset so that I can clear out the IIS cache. And that means that when we hit this error page again, instead of hitting error from SharePoint, we're going to hit my own error. So everything's restarted. Let's try this one again. And so it'll take a couple seconds as the server warms up. But now we've got a totally custom error page. And it's not well designed. This isn't what you'd use on the internet, obviously. But I just, again, wanted to show that you can make something entirely custom, something that doesn't look a thing like SharePoint, and you can put whatever you want on this page. The other thing I want to point out is that you don't have to worry about the path to your page being exposed or anything about the page. I could have called it fooglyboogly.foo, and it still would redirect to that. It would still work exactly the way it's supposed to. So, and it would look like it's coming from this location instead. So for your users, it looks trustworthy. You don't have to worry about the path, but you can give them an experience that fits in with the rest of your site, and that's really important. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation again. So now you've got your design, and you've kind of got your master page worked out. You've got your layouts page or your error pages worked out. And now I'm going to touch on this concept of theming. And themes are this feature in SharePoint. It's entirely new for 2010. If you've used themes in 2007, you're going to have to relearn a couple things for 2010. But they allow a really quick change of colors and fonts across your site. We can recolor images as well. So if you have things like a gradient in the background, we can recolor that. It doesn't work as well with photos, like I'll show you in a minute. And then custom CSS can also be themed really easily. There's 3 steps to it. There's the CSS registration control, which is how I'm using CSS on my master page. There's putting your CSS in a themable location, and that's basically a themable folder underneath one of the 2 locations. We'll look for CSS, which there's documentation around that, or if there's not, there will be by RTM. And then the third thing is using comments within your CSS to tell us how to recolor things. So I'll just move back over to my demo real quick. And I'll go back into SharePoint Designer. And I'm just going to quickly show you what my CSS looks like. And so this is fully semantically correct. But I have these comments in here that are saying things like recolor this image with accent 1 lighter, or replace this color with accent 4 lighter. And so these are the things that tell the theming engine how to recolor my CSS when a theme is applied. And since I've made this fully themable, this design can actually be recolored with whatever I want. So I'm going to navigate to the page to retheme things. And since I didn't leave in any of the controls that let me navigate to it directly, I have to actually remember the URL. But you could have a different experience if you wanted. And I'm just going to pick something Let's go with purple. Purple sounds good. So this is purple with a little bit of orange. And when I apply it, it'll take a couple seconds to generate the new CSS files and the new images it's going to be using. But when it's all done, it'll be my site and my design, but entirely different colors. And that's really how theming is supposed to work. And where that might be really important to you is if you have a corporate internet site, you might have different brands you want to support with the same design. You might have the blue brand and the yellow and red brand and the green brand. And this is a way for you to really easily create one design and then adapt it to all those uses without writing any extra code for that, and quickly generate new branded sites really easily. So I think that's a really powerful feature, and I encourage you to find uses for it in your own scenarios. So moving on, now you've got the right design, you've got the right colors, you've got the right layouts, but what if you don't have the right language? What if your users speak more than English, or you want to just have multiple versions of the site for different languages? We've got a couple features that support that. There's first the multilingual user interface. That applies mostly to application UI, so things that are out-of-the-box strings will be automatically translated by SharePoint based on the user's preferences. And then we also have this concept of variations for the content that you've created. And variations are a way to really quickly and easily create separate versions of the site for different languages, and then easily manage them from one central location. So you can really fine-tune the experience for each language that you want to support with your site. Variations are a really powerful feature for doing that. Another feature is that only the right content, right? You've got the right language and the right colors. You really only want to show the right content. And there's a few ways you can do that. There's first this concept of content deployment. That's a feature that we've had since 2007. And if you've worked with it with 2007, it got a kind of bad rap because it wasn't quite fully fleshed out. But in 2010, we've done our best to make it as rock solid as possible. And what content deployment is it's a way for you to have a development environment and a testing environment and a production environment, or however many steps you want to have in that flow, where you can do all your work over in one place and then use content deployment to package that up and apply it to another server to test it out, and then package that up and apply it to production really easily in one step. So that's a really powerful way to get that flow of customization and data from one place to the other. The other features we have around this are the approval process. We have a whole workflow around that. We have a couple out-of-the-box workflows that you can use to say that these people can write content, these people have to approve it before it goes live over here. And the out-of-the-box workflows are also entirely customizable. So if you want to remove a step or add a couple steps or make them parallel, that's fully possible out of the box. And we've got a couple tools that really make that simple. There's SharePoint Designer is the first tool that you'll be using to work with workflows in SharePoint. And then if you get a really complicated workflow or you just want to visualize something, you can export from Visual Studio or from SharePoint into Visio rather. And in Visio you can see how the workflow is laid out. You can see the process of information. You can tweak things around, make new steps. And then when you have it the way you want, you can import it back into SharePoint Designer and apply it to SharePoint. So that's a really powerful way to get really complicated workflows up and running in SharePoint. So now you've got the right content. You want to make it shiny, right? And Silverlight is a big thing. I want to just call out the places where SharePoint is using Silverlight. We are definitely interested in Silverlight and working with having it out of the box. We've got 4 main places that we have it out of the box in 2010. The Create Gallery and the Org Browser probably aren't very interesting for an internet-facing site. I just wanted to call them out for completeness. The things that you'll probably be most interested in are actually the media web part, which allows you to embed videos and media in your pages directly, and also the Silverlight web part, which allows you to just embed any XAP from any location into SharePoint as well. So I'm actually going to demo the Silverlight web part to show you how powerful that is. And we're back to my horrible site. I'm going to change the master page back to the original master page just so that I can have the ribbon back and work with my page more easily. But you'll notice it's still purple because I still have the theme applied. So themes work with the out-of-the-box master pages as well as any custom master pages you make. I'm going to go back to the home page. And what I'm going to do is I actually, over here, I have an XAP that I created earlier. And what this XAP is supposed to do is it will take the pictures that are in this document library and show them on the home page in a relatively interesting way. Although, again, I'm not a designer, so it's only a little bit interesting. So I'm going to put this page into edit mode, and I'm going to go here, and I want to add a web part. And you can kind of also, just to slow down for a minute, you can kind of see how this page layout works with this page. This one's relatively restrictive in that it says that there should be a title here and an image here, and you should put links here, and then web parts are down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a web part to the bottom, and I'm going to find the Silverlight web part and add that. And then I'm just going to paste in the URL that I copied earlier. Now, this is obviously within the same SharePoint site as this page, but I could also have found something on bing.com or something and use that as well. So I'm just going to add that and save the page. And then if I scroll down the bottom, you'll see that I've got some pictures here. They're obviously still knitting because that's my theme for today. But they're all here, and they're relatively interesting. I didn't animate them or anything, but it is Silverlight. Now, the thing is, though, that my boyfriend gets a little nervous whenever I have pictures of baby booties or baby stuff around. So what I want to do is I want to say, well, let's stop showing the baby booties. Let's give him some peace of mind. So I'm going to edit this one and say, don't show it in the Silverlight app. And that's just a column that I created on this library to say whether or not to show things. Everything else should be shown if it's possible. So if I go back to the home page and refresh this to reload the XAP, no more baby booties. And the way that works is through this concept called the Silverlight Client OM. And there we go. The Client OM is basically a Silverlight or JavaScript wrapper that works with SharePoint Server OM, so it allows you to really easily get data out of SharePoint or update data within SharePoint or show your users some really interesting visualizations on the data in a language that you're used to working with. So you don't have to worry about calling web services or setting up a web service to get you what you need. The SharePoint OM is actually exposed in languages that you're already working with. So I consider those actually really powerful as well. Now, working with data, we also have a few other ways you can get data in or out of SharePoint. There's the REST API that you may or may not have heard of. There's the normal web services that we have had in the previous release, and we continue to develop upon those. And then in 2010, we have this concept of external content types. And this is actually a way to get data into SharePoint, really more than getting data out of SharePoint. External content types are a concept where you have your data somewhere else. It could be a SQL server or some SAP server or something, and you want to pull that data into SharePoint. You do that through an external content type, and then for your users and for some of the OM, that data actually looks like it's coming from SharePoint. So there's one central place to find all the information. You don't have to try to marry a bunch of different UI together in order to get everything you need to your users. So that's also pretty powerful. So now that you have all this data and all this information, and it looks the right way, you want to know what's going on with it. We've got a few features around that as well. We've got traffic monitoring and analytics, and those aren't full-fledged click streams. If you want something that powerful, you'll probably have to get a third-party tool. But we do tell you this page used to get 1,000 clicks a day. Now it's only got 200. Maybe you have a broken link. Maybe your users just aren't interested anymore. We have search analytics to tell you what your users are searching for, so that if you don't have topics that they want to find, you can easily figure out which ones you need to create. We've got server health and monitoring. We put a lot of investment in making sure that you know whether or not your server is healthy and what you can do to make it healthy if it's not. And then the final thing I want to talk about is this concept of the developer dashboard. So this is a really powerful tool. It's in the browser. You can turn it on when the page is rendering to show you where the page is spending its time. So it'll tell you whether or not the page is going to the server multiple times to get more data, or whether a particular web part is spending a lot of time to render, or whether your JavaScript is running for an inordinately long amount of time. So you can plug your own design into the developer dashboard and get all that analysis as well on your own design, so you can make your pages as performant and reliable as possible. So that's all pretty powerful. Now, I want to just call out, there's a couple other sessions you should probably check out if you're going to get started with SharePoint development. Paul Stubbs on Monday did a great talk on designing corporate websites using SharePoint 2010. And then Andrea Ingberts did building rich and interactive experiences in SharePoint. Both great talks. I encourage you to look them up for the information they can give you. I didn't cover, I tried not to overlap too much with those talks, so there's a lot of great information in there as well. Now, earlier in the talk, I might have mentioned that my design was crap, but I wanted to show you some good designs, things that caught my eye that are all running on SharePoint on the web today. The place I found these websites is at wssdemo.com. That site has a list of over 1,000 websites that are public and available and running on SharePoint, so they'll give you some ideas of what you can do with SharePoint, what's possible with SharePoint. But I just wanted to pull out a baker's dozen of things that have been built on SharePoint and just kind of exercise how the platform works. So I wanted to start with Carlsberg because it's green and it's beer and it's St. Patrick's Day. Unfortunately, Guinness isn't running on SharePoint, so I couldn't show you that. But if anyone knows anyone at Guinness who wants to move their site over, let me know, because I'd love to work with them on that. But I just love how colorful this is, how bright and cheery it is, and how you would never know it was SharePoint if you went and just browsed to this. On a completely different design, there's Eneco. And I'm going to stop pronouncing things pretty quick because some of these aren't English sites, and I'm not so great with pronunciation in French or other languages. But I love how clean this design is, how bright and fresh it is, and how they've got this whole experience around this picture in the middle. Moving on, there's this experience, which is obviously different from the other ones. I think this one is a French site, so I'm not going to try to actually pronounce anything on it, but I just liked how they went through for a very corporate look, very serious and business-oriented look. I thought this one was just bright, and I love how they use the pink and incorporate that in around all these pictures of food that just make me kind of hungry, even though I just ate breakfast. This is an entirely different site as well, and this one obviously looks very studious and very much like you can do things and build things. Really brings you into their site. Now this one has a really great picture of this airplane right in front and kind of draws you in, gives you a different perspective on things. This is one of the French sites, so I'm not even going to try to pronounce what this site is. But I love the way they've organized the pictures and how you can kind of scroll through them. And it's, again, just a different experience from all the other ones. And the sampling bias I've got here is just, these are sites that I picked because I thought they looked interesting for one reason or another. I tried to get a decent spread. But again, I really encourage you to go to wssdemo.com and check out all the sites they've got listed there. So maybe if you've got an e-banking site or you want to create something very business-like, you might go with a design like this, much more serious and clean colors, clean lines. On the other hand, maybe you want to have a more whimsical approach to your design. Maybe you want to have a picture of the Earth just very curved, more curved than you probably ever see it in real life. Maybe you want to get as much information as you can to your user as quickly as possible, so you go with a very text-based design. And all this data could be stored in various ways in SharePoint, but make it really easy for you to get it out and get it available to your users and be refreshing it constantly with newer, more exciting data. Or maybe you just want to go with a picture. And if I remember correctly, this is the website that had this picture rotating through various healthy people that look like they've exercised regularly. I don't know how I stopped on the guy who's curling 50 pounds. Just kind of happened, I guess. But he's kind of cute. Anyway, maybe you have a different appeal. Maybe you want to embed a couple ads in the page, encourage people to find more products that are like yours, have a whole experience around that. Maybe you want to promote your venue and tell people about things that are going on and have a different thing. And you can imagine that this is all driven by a SharePoint calendar behind the scenes or an events list or something like that, and just displayed in this really interesting and dynamic way. And this is actually the last site I'm going to show you. This is the New Holland site, and I love the picture of the snow up in Seattle. We don't get much snow, actually, so this winter we got about 0 inches, and I really missed that, so I wanted to end with some snow. But those are just a few examples of things you can do in SharePoint. There are thousands more on WSS Demo, so I really encourage you to check that out. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. If you have any questions, please go to the mic so that they can hear you on the recording and I don't have to repeat it. Give my voice a couple seconds to rest. And then while we're answering questions, I'm going to just put up this page for resources you can use. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, are we there? Good. By the way, I've been following you on Twitter forever,
thank you.
It's so good to see you. So I've been branding a public-facing site in SharePoint in 2010 and having a blast at it. It's very cool.
Okay.
And but the one thing that is different from 2007 to 2010 is being able to add a web part into content editing areas. And so, is there a way to turn that off?
I don't believe so. You should be able to use a less rich text area, I believe.
Yeah, I used a content editor web part basically in that
Right.
area instead so that I could still control that.
Right.
So that's the only one thing that I would be really excited to see if there was some way that we could turn that off, just because to keep that rigidity of
Right.
everything. But
Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. It might work to remove the web part privileges from your content contributors, but that's only if they don't have to use web parts other places. So I'm not sure that we have a good answer for you, unfortunately, but that's great feedback, and I'll definitely be thinking about that as we do the next version.
cool, thank you.
All right, thank you.
I have a question. How does SharePoint Designer work with internet-facing sites? We've set one up with authentication, and you can't connect with Designer in the 2007.
So SharePoint Designer 2010 doesn't work with SharePoint 2007 and vice versa. It's very much 2010 to 2010 and 2007 to 2007.
Yeah, but even if I've got 2010, can I connect with Designer to an internet-facing site?
You should be able to, and if you're not, I would appreciate it if you would send me an email so we can dig into that and see what's going on.
Hi.
Hi.
So actually, I'm going to ask a question that was asked of me, so I'm
Okay.
sort of translating this. On the page layout in SharePoint 2007, if you didn't use one of, like if you didn't put any content in the top zone, you'd get a bit of a like a gap in your page layout. In 2010, are we seeing that still?
I don't know about the.
I don't know why.
Sorry about that. I don't know about that specific instance. I would assume that you shouldn't be getting a gap there, but I'd have to try it out to be sure. And if you are, you may or may not be able to change that with CSS. But I'd have to look into that to be sure.
Then, on that note, let me ask one more question.
Yep,
and then
sure.
Can you actually, on the page layout, take out the zone? Like if, I think the question is, how difficult is it to, like if you're getting that gap or that space? I know in a SharePoint 2007, you couldn't take that zone out.
On a page-by-page basis, you mean?
No.
Or just entirely?
Yeah, entirely.
You should be able to customize the page layouts to remove the zones. I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't be able to in
Let me,
2010.
okay.
But maybe we should follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I'll get with you after.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Where does Expression fit in all this? Since I create pages in Expression that I can open in Visual Studio, can I use Expression?
Expression doesn't have a lot of tie-ins with SharePoint this release. The way I could see it working is if you created your design in Expression and then moved that into the master page in SharePoint. The page-to-page translation isn't really there at this point, so you would probably have to translate the design that you made in Expression into SharePoint-y artifacts.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
What's the roadmap for Microsoft Translation integration with SharePoint?
I wish I knew. Unfortunately, they haven't asked, or they haven't talked to us very much yet about how to integrate the translation with SharePoint, but I'm definitely interested in that, and I'd be surprised if we didn't do anything in that space. I just don't know what our plans are that I can actually talk about. A nice shirt, by the way. All right, anyone else? All right, then thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate you getting up so early to see this. Thank you.